We have a really interesting set of panelists, and for those of us who missed yesterday, we're going to get a little bit of idea what happened yesterday. Dr. Shattuck is going to talk about science fiction. Isn't that right? Yeah. Yes. In fact, George, how do you say your name? Annis is also going to talk about science fiction, Brave New World in 1984, and these predictive science fiction tendencies. And Dr. Gottlieb, who comes all the way from England, is going to talk about metaphors for an age, right? Computers being the metaphor for our age. And Evelyn Fox Keller is going to answer the question, or I don't know if you can answer, raise and discuss the question about human nature, what is human nature, and whether it can be changed. So it sounds like it's going to be fun, and only 10 minutes per person, and then we open to discussion for everybody.
Want me to start?
Sure.
Can you hear? Is this on? Can you hear me now? No. Is there anyone alive back there? Hello? There we are. Thank you. I'll put it a little further away. I think I ought to state my bona fides here. I'm a literary type who had the temerity to write a book called Forbidden Knowledge, in which there is a too long chapter on science. And somehow I got through the filtering system and on this platform. I'd like to complete what Pinker started yesterday. His first quote, I think, was, "Man has no nature." But he didn't tell us the rest, and he didn't give the source. Man has no nature. What he has is history, and that's Ortega y Gasset. But Emerson was waiting for him at the pass. Emerson says, what many of you know, there is no, properly speaking, there is no such thing as history. There is only biography. Now, the subsequent quote has not been written, but it is going from biography to biology. I wrote out 10 minutes worth of prose here to keep me to 10 minutes. It's called A Tale of Two Species. One of the most striking early experiments on human nature has not been mentioned at this conference. Nor, to my knowledge, has this experiment been cited in the vast scientific literature in the areas we are concerned with. I am referring to what Einstein would have called a thought experiment, like his mysteriously moving trains and his elevators bobbing up and down in space. In the 18th century, when this experiment was performed, the commanding scientific position occupied today by research in molecular biology was occupied by an outwardly different, yet potentially similar activity, namely voyages of discovery to unknown lands in order to describe their flora, fauna, and exotic human societies. The report of one such voyage of discovery, a report widely and attentively read to this day, appeared anonymously in London in 1726. Its publisher made sturdy claims for the account's veracity. This 400-page book rapidly became a bestseller and a classic for all ages and in all languages. Gulliver's Travels may have been a work of fiction, even a clever hoax, but it was also, and still is, particularly in the fourth and last book, what the astute English essayist William Hazlitt called, quote, an experiment upon human life. Geographic exploration, imaginary as well as authentic, served both as telescope and as microscope focused on ourselves. The clever fantasy of Swift's narrative cannot hide for long the depth of his probing. My synopsis of Book 4 will be ruthlessly brief. Now we're in Gulliver, now we're in Swift. On Gulliver's last voyage, Swift casts him ashore on an island where human nature has been passed, as it were, through a prism. The prism separates the rational faculties from all other possibly or presumably baser faculties. A society of horse-like creatures called the this is supposed to be a whinny, Houyhnhnms, has received reason and language and lives in peace. Bands of ape-like yahoos have received the remainder of our characteristics and live like quarrelsome brutes. Swift relates Gulliver's gradual, and he lives for some time on the island, gradual conversion to unstinting admiration for the dignified, cold-hearted, talking horses. He spurns the humanoid yahoos. Yet in one uproarious episode, a naked, rutting female yahoo gets the hots for Gulliver and goes after him as a sexy representative of her own species. Finally torn apart by his disturbing resemblance to both sets of deprived and monstrous creature, Gulliver works himself up into an uncharacteristic, near-violent rant against his castaway lot. He goes manifestly mad and loses his humanity until he is later rescued and cared for by a reassuring humane and civil Portuguese sea captain. Now, what is all this preposterous narrative about? For his contemporaries in the Enlightenment, Swift was writing a complex political and philosophic fable warning his fellows, among other things, not to go too far in favoring reason over all other faculties and feelings in our nature. For us, today, Swift has constructed the prototype of a classic science fiction plot that will not go away. In his compulsive travel, Gulliver comes upon a remote island where human beings have evolved or regressed into two separate species, distinct from us and from each other. Swift portrays a double dystopia. The monstrosity of both the bestial yahoos and the haughty Houyhnhnms unstrings Gulliver to the point of insanity. Here, then, is my first tale of two species, a highly cautionary tale which demonstrates that tampering with our nature will cause grief and diminishment, as to Gulliver. More than a century later, H.G. Wells' novel The Time Machine, that's 1895, appropriated Swift's plot device of a traveler marooned in a land inhabited by two species descended from humans. The vacuous, doll-like Eloi, descended from wealthy landowners, live without toil. On the other hand, driven underground long ago, the working class have turned into Morlocks, machine-making savages who feed on the Eloi like livestock. For Wells, the future reveals the social and biological decadence of mankind brought about by our incorrigible selfishness. The Time Machine, with its revised version of the double dystopia plot, has established a firm grip on our science fiction imagination, as much so as its near contemporary, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now, another century later, namely today, we find before us yet another version of a time traveler coming upon a society in which humankind has evolved into two distinct species, one species favored in every medical, genetic, and scientific cure and enhancement, and the other species left behind in the dust of unimproved humanity. This sci-fi situation provides the frame narrative for a giddily optimistic book of treatment of reproductive genetics and germline enhancements of every kind. In his book, Remembering Eden, Lee Silver names his two species, the gen-rich and the naturals. He acknowledges H.G. Wells' novel twice, and this is in his book, not the talk that he gave yesterday. He acknowledges H.G. Wells twice yet appears to be unaware of his earlier ancestor, Swift. Lee Silver is our Gulliver more than he knows. Most of the lively exposition of Remaking Eden endorses and justifies the genetic measures available to improve ourselves and especially our offspring. Individual choice exercised in the open marketplace of clinical treatments and procedures need not be restrained by any special scruple or limit other than potential individual harm. Quote from Silver, "Thus we shall gain control over our own destiny." And Silver can be categorical. Quote, "In all cases, I will argue, the use of reprogenetic technologies is inevitable." This we did have yesterday. Like Gulliver fawning over the reasonable Houyhnhnms, Silver revels in the unimaginable extensions, that's a quote, unimaginable extensions of human capacities available to favored children. Now Gulliver finally glimpses the grotesque division of human nature that has misled him. Can we say the same of Silver? In a few passages, Silver reveals a lingering uneasiness over the picture he has painted. Twice, he uses the term horrific for his own painted portrait of a society. He uses the term horrific to refer to the scientifically caused breakdown of human beings into two non-interbreeding species. In the epilogue, set in the year 2350, the fictional Dr. Varship surveys the results of genetic enhancements to give, quote, better lives to the gen-rich class now developed into a separate species. Quote, "Where had we gone wrong?" Varship Silver mutters to himself and recognizes that, quote, "it is too late to do anything at all." Silver doesn't go mad like Gulliver. Instead, he frames his celebratory book in a prologue and an epilogue that narrate our now familiar storyline out of Swift and Wells. For Silver, that tale expresses regretful resignation over the division of human nature into two incompatible and stunted species. I find no satire, no spoof here, only muffled sorrow. I have rarely read a book so deeply ambivalent, trying to put on a brave face. One more comment. One of the most widely desired human enhancements is healthy longevity culminating in immortality. Swift and Wells fill out their narratives with enough variations on the human condition not to have to deal with the fountain of youth. But Silver is obliged to face this desire. His title, Remaking Eden, directly invokes Adam and Eve, who were created immortal. And Silver's long menu of enhancements in the last chapter, including cognitive attributes, moral character improvements, and radio telepathy. This menu cries out for longevity and immortality as the culminating offerings. His one reference to, quote, the Age Buster Gene Pack, which you can buy and establish, comes as an 8-line afterthought in the epilogue. Silver has not met the challenge that his own book holds out to him. Consequently, Silver has avoided the big question: is genetically programmed death one of the defining characteristics of human nature? Those of us who believe it is find that in Remaking Eden, Silver has missed a great opportunity to carry Swift's and Wells' storyline to the furthest challenge of mortality and human nature. Is life without death worth living? Thanks. I'd like to add that I respect Silver's book very much and was deeply stirred by it. This is the result.
I don't know if I could follow that, Roger, but but I think of Gulliver. I always think of the Struttlebugs, and his immortal sitting on their front porch, living forever but disintegrating slowly.
Worst case possible.
Absolutely, worst case scenario. So you can have inhumane immortality, if you will. In any event, to follow that, the two questions I think preoccupied at least many of the speakers at this symposium are what kind of a human do we want in the future, assuming we knew what human nature is, which we didn't define, but how would we like to change it? And then a second question that Martha Minow put, I thought, quite well, where she asked, how do we create a world where differences are respected and not a grounds for extermination? And what I'm going to spend these few minutes on is looking at the two most well-known, I guess, cautionary fables of the last century, Brave New World and 1984, and seeing if we can learn anything about the future of human nature from contemplating those different types of dystopias. We've heard Brave New World referred to, I think, 5 times in this conference. No one's mentioned 1984, which is quite interesting. Brave New World, of course, was a society based on conditioning and drugs. You were born in this process in pods of 96 embryos that were identical. You were assigned a very specific class, alpha, beta, beta, theta, et cetera, deltas, which would define you throughout your life, where you'd work, what you'd wear, what you'd do. And not only were you conditioned to be that way, if you were found to be dysfunctional or to keep you functioning in that way and happy, you had slogans and you had drugs, heavy-duty drugs, which many people have pointed out we have already in our society now. This view of society that we're going to essentially dehumanize ourselves, right, take away what we think freedom and creativity and things that help define us as humans, is the view that has been, by the way, adopted by the President's Bioethics Council. As you remember, it's true. Their view is that we are on the road to dehumanization and commodification of humans, and that the only way to stop that is to prohibit things like human cloning and germline genetic engineering, and to worry a lot about embryo research, organ sales, egg sales, et cetera, things that would dehumanize and commodify us. And that has led the Council to make those types of recommendations that they've made, and to go down this road of trying to regulate. I think their next step would be trying to regulate Lee Silver's new reproductive technology. So they would be horrified at the word reprogenetics and try to stop that. The other dystopia, the 1984, which people have for the last 30 years say, well, that's not going to happen. Since 1984, basically, people would say, that's not going to happen, is George Orwell's vision of a government that does not rely on conditioning and drugs to dehumanize its people, but relies on fear and surveillance. A government that relies on the strategy of perpetual war to convince its citizens that they should basically give up their humanity and submit to a regime where they're totally under observation, totally under control of Big Brother. Now, since September 11th, Big Brother has emerged as a much more likely scenario than Brave New World, even though we've had very little commentary about it outside of groups like the American Civil Liberties Union, when John Ashcroft says that he's going to protect our civil rights by doing away with the need for search warrants, wiretap search warrants, by putting people in jail without habeas corpus, by sticking people on Guantanamo, away from all of our constitutional rights that we have in the United States, and even to the point of apparently countenancing torture, although we continue to say we're still against torture. But nonetheless, the society built on perpetual war is one we have to start taking very seriously in a terrorist, fearful community. And indeed, a number of speakers at this conference have talked about the new technologies, especially nanotechnology, but any of the genetic technologies as well, being in the wrong hands. No one really specified terrorists, but we know, and the computer technology, but we know what they're talking about, that in the wrong, any powerful technology, obviously in the wrong hands, reverses its potential for good into a potential for evil. And I think that in this society, we have to take 1984 as precautionary tale at least as seriously as Huxley's Brave New World. And you don't have to, even just on a literary level of newspeak, Huxley's new language in which it's impossible to voice dissent ultimately and impossible to disagree with the crowd, is actually being used by the administration. It's great. You may remember just 2 weeks ago when the war was going poorly, Rumsfeld was being criticized for not following the strategy of General Powell during the first Gulf War of overwhelming force. And he said, no, that's old think. A word right out of 1984. That's old think, and we're going to do new think, to start to fight our wars. In commenting on and comparing Brave New World to 1984, Erich Fromm said the question that both of them raised was, can human nature be changed in such a way that man, humans, will forget his longing for freedom, for dignity, for integrity, for love? That is, he says, to say, can man forget that he is human? Or are there are those things basic human characteristics? Well, I don't know the answer to that question, but I can tell you this. There are at least 2 other life forms on the planet that will have a lot to say about our future. They've been mentioned briefly in this conference. One is the corporate form. We talk about immortality of humans, but we've already created a life form on the planet that is potentially immortal, and that is the corporation. Corporations have no natural lifespan. They can live forever, although it is very important to see that the majority of them die very young deaths. It doesn't mean that they're not guaranteed immortality, but they're potentially immortal. They are set up to do a specific thing, made up of shareholders who have limited liability and can potentially live forever. And that means they can accumulate wealth forever. They can grow very, very, very powerful over decades and even centuries, and can control large segments of our society, and certainly can control large portions of new technology, as corporations like Microsoft have shown it is very possible to do, even very young corporations like that. And so the corporate life form is one we have to take very seriously. They, in fact, run most of the governments in the world. We always talk about governments and their sovereignty, but the only thing that makes governments threatening is their military. We have, so far haven't let corporations have their own military, although they certainly do have their own police forces, right? But there's another life form, too, which I think is worth acknowledging, and that's a new life form called the non-governmental organization, which people are very ambivalent about. Some people are very happy with. But it's a life form that has grown up and really multiplied almost exponentially in the last decade in the world to be a counterbalancing force, both for governments and, as importantly, for corporations, in trying to, well, they all have their own purposes, but in trying to be a counterweight to forces that the people in the non-governmental organization movement think are destroying the planet and destroying the conditions under which people can be human. And E.O. Wilson's book, The Future of Life, even more ambitious than our conference, The Future of Humans, argues at the end that the non-governmental organizations are really the best hope for the planet and the best hope for humanity. I'm not sure whether that's true or not, but I think it points out how important a force this is. Just to give the example that he gives is that in the last 30, 40 years, most of the degradation of the planet has been caused by corporations essentially doing whatever they want to do to extract resources from the earth. And that up till, what, the last decade, mostly people, environmentalists, have tried to plead with governments to try to contain corporations, or plead with corporations to try to be nice. In the last 10 years, non-governmental organizations have found a different strategy. They rent rainforests. or simply buy land and keep it, conserve it, both for biodiversity and just for basic conservation. And that new life form is going to have a significant impact on the planet. The non-governmental organizations, of course, are those government organizations that the United States and Britain, what is sometimes referred to as a coalition, are trying to turn the humanitarian aspects of aid to Iraq over to right now. And they're the only ones that can be trusted ultimately. So in any event, in summary and conclusion, how do we create a world where differences are respected and not grounds for extermination remains, I think, the central question. But that we can talk about governments, we can talk about self-regulation, but I think we also have to recognize two other life forms on the planet, the corporation and the non-governmental organization. And for good and evil, and I hope for good, they will play a major role in answering that question.
Is this audible? No? Well, I don't know if that's because I was speaking louder or move this closer, but this is okay, is it?
Somebody switched it on.
Ah, that would help. Okay. When I started thinking about the subject of this conference, the future of human nature, a few months ago, the first thing I did was to go back and read a book published in, I think, the mid-'80s by a man called David Boulter, who's both a classicist and a computer scientist. He wrote a book called Turing's Man, and it was about the impact of the computer on the way we think of ourselves. It argues that the conception of human nature that we have has been significantly affected by the development of the digital computer. And one of the key concepts in this book, which I'd like to think about a bit, is the concept of a defining technology for an era. Now, defining technology is something that is so successful and so impressive to the people of the time that they think, my God, everything is like that. Everything works like that. Even we work like that. Actually, the second part is sort of optional. It's not always the case that people come to the conclusion that they themselves work like that. But with the defining technology, you come to the conclusion that's the key to the universe. That's how the universe works. Now, the first real defining technology we know about is that of the ancient Greeks. And the defining technology for them, really, in this sense, was the craftsman, and in particular, the potter, who, at his wheel, who is fashioning form out of matter. That was thought to be so impressive and wonderful that the most important thinkers of the day developed their metaphysics, their conception of the world in those terms. Plato's master craftsman, who created the universe in his Timaeus, which was very influential in the West, partly because there was a long period when that was actually the only work of Plato's that was available to the West. The master craftsman fashions the world out of raw matter, imposes form on it in the way that a potter does. Plato's theory of ideas is, in effect, a consequence, an aspect of this defining technology, in the sense that it sees reality as the imposition of, physical reality, as the imposition of forms on matter. Plato's ideas are the forms. Now, the next biggest defining technology is in the scientific revolution, and that is the machine, and in particular, clockwork. People saw clocks, and other types of machines were, for whatever reason, immensely impressed by them and started thinking, my God, the whole universe is a clock. The human body is a machine. This was very much the thesis of Descartes. He said that our bodies are machines. Of course, he also thought that the mind couldn't be dealt with that way, and the way he tried to relate mind and body essentially didn't work, isn't found very plausible. So people later rather adapted his ideas to make our minds machines as well, which is, I suppose, basically how we think of them now. Our conception of scientific knowledge is really also formed by that defining technology. John Locke's account of empirical knowledge is very affected by it. He took as the paradigm example of scientific knowledge the watchmaker's knowledge of his own artifacts. If we could only understand bits of the world in the same way that a clockmaker understands the clock that he's made, then we would really understand nature. That's what Locke said, and that's probably still really how we think of it. Now, the third biggest defining technology is, of course, the digital computer. That is plainly related to the mechanical world picture. It is a form of machine. So it's not the case that each new defining technology obliterates the last one. It sometimes builds on it. And by a computer, I mean a computer as defined by Turing, a Turing machine. Now, we think of our own minds as if they were computers. We talk about software. We regard our memories, our character to some extent, as software running on the hardware of the brain. In science fiction, and in fact even at this conference, we talk about the possibility one day, if the technology were ever available, to transport ourselves in the form of information, to download ourselves, to transmit ourselves as happens in Star Trek. Well, actually, there are two theories about how the transporters work in Star Trek, whether matter is actually transferred or whether it's just information. But according to that fine work, The Physics of Star Trek, which some of you may know, the more plausible interpretation of the series is that it's information that's transformed, that's sent by the matter transmitters. So our current conception of ourselves, and to some extent also the universe, because of course there are also people who speak of the universe as a computer, is formed by the digital computer. That's our defining technology. And the question at the moment, and the question I want to ask about that is this now the end of the road? Is this the real defining technology? Have we now got to the truth or not? Now, that's a question that's impossible to answer because by definition, the defining technology of the age is the one we think really has the truth. But if you look at intellectual history, if you look at this from the point of view of a historian, you realize that in the past, everyone always thought, now, finally, at last, we have the truth. Are we really different? Is it really true that we have got to the bottom of things? Or will there maybe be other technologies that will lead us to think of the universe and, more relevantly today, ourselves in a different way? Now, whether another technology will come along and do this, I think, depends on what works. It's when something works very effectively that people stop and think, my God, no, that's the way things really are. Is there going to be any other such? There may or may not be. I just listed a couple of possibilities. Now, one is non-classical computers, quantum computers, which we haven't spoken about much here. But just supposing they are developed, excuse me, properly, just supposing they do work, they do start to do extremely impressive things, will that start to affect the way we think of ourselves? Will we, for example, start to think of ourselves as sometimes in superpositions of states? Will we borrow the language of quantum mechanics to start to understand human nature? That's one possibility. Suppose string theory really started to develop as a cosmological theory and became so impressive that people thought this really is how things are. Perhaps that too would begin to affect how we think of ourselves. We can't really say how now. It's hard to see that we would ever think of ourselves as one-dimensional beings, not just in Herbert Marcuse's sense, but in this more literal sense. But it's at least a possibility. The third thing I was thinking of is more biological. we've been talking about genetic engineering, but we've also heard from Christine about the possibility of, as it were, bypassing the genome and achieving what we want to achieve on human nature directly by forms of nanotechnology. Now, just supposing that pills or some other form of drug delivery enabled us to do vastly more than we can do at the moment. In particular, supposing they enabled us to provide almost any sort of mental state at any stage to anyone, would that start to become a defining technology? Would we start to think of human nature as a set of states that we can manipulate with drugs? How would that affect the way we see ourselves? And speaking of biology, another thing I should mention is that it does seem to me that the other main technology we've been talking about at this conference, genomics, is also affected by the Turing machine defining technology. We think we talk of the genetic code, we explain it in terms of almost in terms of a digital computer. Is that again something that will change if another defining technology takes over? So those are the main questions I wanted to ask. There was one other thing I wanted to raise briefly. Another very important work written quite a while ago that I think is of importance to us is an essay on nature by John Stuart Mill, written in round about the 1850s, I think. And he attacked, to my mind, with complete success, the notion that there is a coherent form of objection to what we might do in the form of saying that it interferes with nature. Now, the conception of interfering with nature, and by extension, I think this can be applied to the conception of interfering with human nature, is, he argued, incoherent and depends on a systematic ambiguity in the way we use the term nature. What do we mean by nature? We can either mean everything that happens, the way things are, or we can mean everything that happens, the way things are if humans don't act, the way things would be if we don't do anything. Now, on the first conception of nature, where it's everything that happens, we don't have to worry about interfering with nature. We can say absolutely certainly it will not happen, because it is logically impossible. It's an incoherent thought. You can't, if nature is what happens, we can't change what happens. If, on the other hand, nature is what would happen without human intervention, then the only way we can avoid interfering with nature is by doing absolutely nothing. Not breathing, preferably even killing ourselves, getting rid of ourselves. So I don't think, and maybe this is something we can talk about in discussion, that the notion of interfering with nature or interfering with human nature is remotely useful or interesting. And if we want to evaluate projects, what we might do with human nature, we have to look at the consequences and the harm. There's no point in thinking of this principle, we mustn't interfere with nature, we mustn't interfere with human nature. Let's be utilitarians and look at the consequences. Thank you.
I originally was thinking of addressing my remarks in the form of small talk against human nature. But then I thought that's silly, because I actually do believe in human nature in a certain sense of the word, or something like human nature, rather much along the lines that Richard Schacht laid out yesterday. I believe that we are biologically determined. The problem is that, first, I don't think that we are determined by individual biology. And second, I think that the talk of human nature gets us into all sorts of difficulties that are, that keep us going around in circles and keeps the opposition to the notion of human nature alive. So let me just try to say, identify some of the problems that we get into. several people at this conference define human nature as that which is universal to the human species, a species-wide characteristics. Now, there are several problems with this notion of human nature. First is the extent to which it is almost inevitably a normative notion. So, human beings are bipedal erect animals, right? Universal species-wide characteristic. Does that mean that people without legs are not human? I take that example because it's so absurd. But comparable examples are very real issues for bioethicists today. What counts as a human being if we demand that human nature be that which is universal? The second, or take the desire to have children. Does that mean that those individuals who don't desire to have children are not human? So the first thing about human nature to stress, if there is such a thing, is that it's necessarily variable in the species. Second problem that talk of human nature gets us into is the problem of location. Where is human nature? Now, for most speakers in this session, the assumption is human nature is inside our bodies, that the brain makes up the mind. But I would argue, along with a couple of people here, that the brain does not make up our minds, that all our brains together collectively make up the individual minds. The individual human mind is a product of the sociality, that Nietzsche was right. It is our sociality that is distinctively human. It is an increasing number of people who have argued that what distinguishes us from the apes is precisely the capacity, an improved capacity for mimicry and imitation that establishes a social world that enables the process of cultural evolution that grows and grows, that changes on its own, and the process changes our brains, changes us in two ways, changes us, and we've learned from neuroscience, from the neurosciences, just how plastic our human brains are. We are rewired by the culture in which we exist. So our internal biology is itself a product of the culture in which we live. That's not only true of the way our brains are rewired, it's not only true of the way our bodies are structured, it's also true down to the level of our genes. I mean, I don't think our genes determine, I don't believe in the genetic blueprint of who we are, but it's far more than DNA. But DNA itself changes in response to cultural evolution. The Baldwin effect has been around for a long time, but it's Baldwinian selection, but it's been largely ignored and increasingly clear that it needs to be attended to. That when we change human culture, we change the conditions under which natural selection operates. Take, for example, the arrival of, we could take the arrival of language, or let's take a more transitional example. Let's talk about the arrival of literacy. The arrival of literacy arose as a social. Literacy did not arise in individual brains. Literacy arose out of a social community. The fact of literacy changes our brains. It enhances our memory, it enhances our capacity, and it rewires us in important ways. We're not yet at a point where we can speak of cultural universals, literacy as a cross-cultural university, but there will come a time when we will, and then will we say, then I think we would be very tempted to say literacy is part of human nature. But where is it? Where will it be? And that will depend on stage of our evolutionary process. It may still be in the culture at large. We may have been become biologically adapted to literacy in important ways and change in the process, changed our human nature. Another problem that has surfaced in these discussions is the assumption that if a trait is universal, it must be genetic. And I think my discussion of the example of literacy was intended to show that it provides an example of a trait that can be universal without being genetic. The point being that all traits that are universal traits that are universal can't a priori be distinguished between being products of the particular cultural social forms that have evolved, because cultural forms, let's go back to the literacy example, a world in which literacy is effectively universal. In such a world, cultures that are not literate will die out. So many traits have become universal just because the cultural conditions in that world, the culture of a different variant is not viable. Okay, another problem that talk about human nature as universal is, how do we know what is universal? And that our overriding tendency to extrapolate from our own cultural expectations to the species as a whole. For example, take the assumption that we are, by our human nature, wired to pursue to maximize our self-interest. Well, there are studies being done around the world of basic economic behavior in different cultures, radically different cultures, and it's not true. Not all people pursue their lives according to the principle of rational economic man. In fact, none of us do. As it becomes increasingly clear, our own behavior is not consistent with the ideological supposition of maximizing self-interest. Or take the desire to have our own genetic offspring. Well, that's very important to us in this culture, but it's not necessarily important in other cultures. There have been many cultures in which having children has a very weak relationship to the biological bearing of children, that adopted children become one's own children. So I just want to be very wary about talking about human nature as a universal characteristic. But actually, very little of the talk in this conference was about that. Very little of this the talk of the concerns about changing human nature had to do with changing species-wide characteristics. In fact, most of the talk had to do with changing the nature of some humans. And changing the nature of some humans is a quite different matter. And there are two questions that immediately arise. One, we refer to changing the nature of which humans, and how should we change the nature of a particular human? One way to change the nature of humans one that we're particularly infatuated with, because it's newest on the horizon, perhaps, is by changing the genetics, and we think that's a way of changing human nature. We haven't had very much good of a success at it yet. Another way is suppose we change the methylation patterns of the DNA and the imprinting patterns of the newly fertilized egg, and we can radically change the nature of the organism that results from that. Well, won't that have changed the nature of that individual, of that human? Or we've talked about technological implants. I remarked on a certain slippage in the conference between modifying different kinds of modification of human nature, genetic and extragenetic. And I think that slippage is in a way, is appropriate, because these are different ways of changing the nature of particular humans. Through nanotechnology implants, through biochemical implants. one thing we haven't talked about as a way of changing the nature of some humans is changing their cultural, economic situations. We know that, for example, who was it who showed the slide of the African children who, I think that was you, who are reproduced in every generation. Part of what makes them, characterize them, is the presence of certain parasites in the community that are transmitted in every generation. We could alter that pattern by cleaning up the water in that community, by providing medical assistance in all sorts of ways. So it's striking that that mode of changing human nature has been so little talked about in this community. So where does that leave us? I think if we agree that what we're talking about is changing the nature of some humans, then we ought to be explicit about the various ways in which we can change the nature and compare them. Along the lines of assess the risks, the costs, the implications for future generations. And cleaning up the parasites has implications for future generations for quite a number of generations down the line. So I want to end with the question, what is so special about genetically manipulating the nature of some humans? Thank you.
Commentators? Yes? Scott, more?
Question for George Annis or Roger Shattuck about the division into species, the speciation into the gene-rich and the gene-poor or something like that, and the idea being that, or the I guess it's the Winnies or something like that, versus the Yahoos. The issue is, I think we have to always be extremely humble in our assumptions about what we're really like. And at any level, we tend to be know-it-alls. In fact, I think it was Dan Koshland used to write editorials in Science and talk about Dr. Know-it-all. And one of the surprising findings that's emerged in the last 20, 30 years is emphasized mainly by Antonio Damasio, who in his book Descartes' Error points out that if you take away the emotions, if you impair the feeling in the human organism, the rational faculty disintegrates. And I think we have to be very wary that there are things like that we may not yet know. And so the assumptions we make about what will happen or what can happen are predicated, on ignorance to some degree. What do you think about that?
Yes.
Well, in the cases which I was talking about, it's a story. It's not just an idea. It's a narrative, an imaginary narrative, which in the case of Swift is a very cautionary tale. Don't think that man lives by reason alone. And don't think there's something wrong with these yahoos. They're as human as the Houyhnhnms. And to some degree, that's the case in Wells. In my friend Lee Silver here, I think he is using, he ought to have equal time here and be able to speak for himself, is using that standard division into two species as a metaphor also, as a story, because somehow he felt he had to present the content in this frame, and I think that shows on his part a certain ambivalence.
Scott, may I say something related to that completely? To your case, in the book I mentioned, I think you missed my talk, but in the book Up from Dragons, The Evolution of Human Intelligence, there's fantastic data that shows the relation of the amygdala to the emotive aspect of symbols. That is, people that perfectly well recognize Jewish stars and Catholic crosses and Boston University maroon and white, When there's injury to the amygdala, they recognize and can identify rationally these symbols, but they lose the emotional content of the Muslim of all of this. Anyway, I think that the fact that we can investigate in a scientific way what you said is going to change things.
But there's a lot of investigation.
Valid,
not yet
non-invasive investigation that scientists tend to not. No one listens to, of course. No, if it doesn't fit their preconceived notions, but scientists also. We've got to let Lee Silver say his.
This is for Evelyn. I'd like to invite you to say a little bit more about something that I think is a problem when people think about human nature, which we might call organism fetishism. That is, to think in terms of the particular creature as the locus of the nature of that kind of creature. Now, when we put our biological hats on, we all know that it's really the form of life of which a particular creature is an instance that is the actual unit that we need to be thinking about, not just of this organism. And something like that may well also be true in the case of human beings, where our human nature needs to be understood in terms of the forms of life in which we particular individuals participate. Only in our case, it's not just biologically describable forms of life, but rather culturally and socially definable forms of life, of which institutions and societies and linguistic communities and so on are examples. And so if human reality is to be thought of not in this particular creature frame as much as in terms of shared forms of life in which particular creatures participate, then we have to, according to your thinking, need to develop our conception of human nature in such a way that the particular individual creatures are not the primary units, but rather the forms of life in which particular creatures participate. So that what is interesting about particular creatures is their capacity to take their places in forms of life.
I think that would be fine. I would welcome giving up talk of human nature and replacing it by talk of human forms of life. But let me just say two things. I had intended to appropriate your term proto-nature, or proto-human nature, because I think that when I said what we've been talking about in this conference is changing the nature of some human beings, actually we've been talking about changing the proto-nature of some human beings. But I also wanted to say I have a larger conception of biology. I think biology, for me, biology includes, just as in the termites, biology includes the social behavior. That's part of their biology. So true is it part of our biology, our social systems and the emergent structures that arise out of that. It's just not coming out of individual biology.
Thank you, Roger, for presenting what your perception of my story. One of the things I was trying to do was to not argue that would actually happen, but that throughout that genes parallel culture in their importance. And in the current world, we have a situation which mirrors that future world in terms of, not in terms of genes, but in terms of cultural disparity between haves and have-nots, which is as extreme as this thing that we're worrying about in the future, and that there are places on Earth where people are very, very, very poor. And coming to what George said, I mean, Brave New World, I think, was much more complex because from a utilitarian perspective, the vast majority of people in Brave New World were very happy. And so if we're trying to achieve happiness, I think that was the whole ambivalence and conflict that Huxley had. If you're trying to achieve happiness, Brave New World sounds a lot better than the world we're living in right now, where there's this huge disparity between haves and have-nots. So when we talk about, the good of society, societies mostly, when they're talking about societies, they're talking about their individual country with their individual citizens, as opposed to the good of the world as all of humanity all over the world as a whole. So the question I have for a number of the speakers is just looking at today's world, where I think all of you would agree there's an enormous amount of unfairness and disparity in distribution of, huge log orders in distribution of goods. If anybody's traveled to poor countries, they understand this. I don't think people can understand unless they've been to those kinds of countries. I mean, what do we do about that to try to, to try to alleviate the problems that we have right now, these huge problems? And I get, this isn't the point of this conference, but I think it's actually very critical because of the huge diversity. And we're talking about cultural diversity is a wonderful thing, but right now it's not a wonderful thing. There are cultures of people who are living miserable lives. What do we do to try to alleviate that problem?
There are people in our own culture living miserable lives.
But not as bad as the lives of the people in very, very
pretty great and getting bigger all the time.
Well, we can debate that later on, but I think there are other countries where the majority of people are living lives that are unimaginable to us right now.
But do you think that's that's somehow a consequence or related to cultural diversity? I mean, are you sort of suggesting that we ought to aim for a more homogeneous world culture in order to have a more equality of goods? Is that the suggestion?
No, the question is whether human nature prevents a brave new world from happening, because human nature drives us. I mean, the opposite of what Evelyn is saying. I'm debating her. Human nature drives us to desire to benefit ourselves, our families, our clans, our tribes, broaden out to our countries.
And do you see disparity, economic disparity, as confirmation of that theory?
As confirmation of that theory?
Yeah, I mean, is that why you believe that Evelyn is not correct?
Well, Evelyn and I can have discussions later on about this, but this is a fundamental philosophical difference that exists among scholars right now. There are people on Evelyn's side of the aisle, and there are those that I happen to find more convincing, who say that this drive towards individual and family and tribal advantage is human nature. And that, yes, as an outcome of that drive, you're going to get this disparity between cultures.
Why?
Why what?
Disparity follow from that?
Because cultures are in battle with each other.
I mean, it seems to me that the positing of a universal drive to improve, to maximize self-interest or to improve one's welfare, I would agree with the second, is precisely what's leading to the diminution of that disparity where it's possible. I mean, we've seen some remarkable changes in countries in terms of the average income and level of spending in a few countries, and it's a very interesting phenomenon. It has everything to do with cultural homogenization. So I don't know why you're arguing it to drive diversity.
So my last question is, do you think that it will inevitably, we will reach, the question is whether the world will always be the way it is now with huge differences, or do you think, this is obviously, we're talking about the future, and I'm asking for your speculation. Do you think there's ever going to be a world where all countries are industrialized and where people can live healthier lives?
Well, the specialists, the people who think about these things, have already written off huge areas of the world as beyond help.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
I think not permanently beyond help. If I could just quickly make one. I think you're assuming that it was that economic wealth is a zero-sum game. Sorry, I think you're assuming that economic wealth is a zero-sum game. You seem to be implying that because tribes or nations are in competition, somebody's got to lose. That's not necessarily the case.
Wealth is power law distributed, and it's power law distributed over the world in general, and even within our country. And in fact, what's going on here is that tendency was reduced after the Second World War, and we're heading more and more back toward that distribution. So I think that radical distribution doesn't have much to do with industrialization. As you see, even in affluent countries, it's not as extreme, for sure. And it's something that bothers me greatly. I think the impact of genomics is going to be essentially negligible on any reasonable time scale, simply because it's not going to get to the people who really need it, the people at that other end of the curve.
We had a question back there.
I have a question that I guess I'd like each of you people to maybe opine on, which is whether you think that it is possible that humans will move forward or change, right? Whether we consider that progress or not, as a species. That's sort of or as a population, right? That's sort of a concept that's fallen out of favor in biology, the idea that populations evolve as opposed to individuals or small groups. And so we started at this end and sort of had some concepts of groups going off in their own direction, which sort of coincided with my original idea of change in humans and human nature. But then you brought up the idea of a defining technology, which is something that is very surprisingly universal, right? Those kind of concepts. And then it sort of, for me, it sort of started falling apart at this end with the analogy of literacy. I mean, I know I've met in my life lots of very human people who were not literate, who had encyclopedic knowledge of botany, or who were perhaps had terrible dyslexia but were great photographers. And to me, what's amazing about our civilization right now, we've grown from a very small base. We know genetically and even culturally, we actually are surprisingly homogeneous in our nature. Is there anyone who believes that that can continue, or are we destined to splinter?
Well, I want to answer by avoiding the question. I'm sorry. And the reason is this, that I welcome the discussion of disparity that came out of Lee Silver's book and we've conducted here. But I think we keep missing a question that we haven't solved. Is there genuinely some form of menace, of real or potential menace in the technologies that are available to us today? We've had various answers. I don't think we can bring it to a vote, but some of us feel very strongly, I do, that the potential menace is so great that we really have to address that question, and George Annis was the person who did that yesterday. And even in that discussion, we got carried away about the institutions and the treaties that he was proposing, rather than, is there a menace? Is there something we should be afraid of and therefore should regulate? In my book, Forbidden Knowledge, I didn't have the guts that George had to come out in favor of a regulatory board and even a bureaucracy. But I did mention two things, that scientists did this for themselves. I think it was the recombinant DNA in 1973, and right here in Cambridge. And that is an instance in which not a government and not a non-governmental organization, but scientists themselves organized to have a moratorium on a certain kind of research until they felt that it was safe. And that, I take it, is what George is proposing. And then the burden of proof should fall upon the scientists who propose these things. I would love, and that's how I'm avoiding your question. I'm sorry, but I wanted to get that out because I think that question needs a little more discussion.
I want to answer your question more directly. If you believe, I don't know, I think I have one anyway. Is this?
It's on.
It's on.
But you have.
Yeah, and you can hear me anyway. But which one? Stereo's better? Oh, well. If you believe in the lessons of the past, we're a mammalian species, and the mean time for survival of a marine animal, invertebrate type species is about 13 million years, plus or minus 20, 30. I mean, it's a big range. But when you get to mammalian species, it's much smaller. It's like 1 to 2 million years or 3 million years. There's not a single species, not one single species of the tens of thousands that were in the Cambrian that's alive today. So that it's very obvious what you believe you're going to personally die? Personally? It's absolutely inevitable that the human species, Homo sapiens, is going to go extinct. The question is when and how. So the fate of the human species is just as given as the fate of your individual body. It's extinction. And there's nothing that's going to stop that.
Yeah, I guess.
So it's your time scale. It's your time scale.
No, it's not a time scale. It's more a question of whatever the time scale. Do you believe that it's possible that humans as a population will somehow evolve into something different, or is it really always the biological point? Some individual will, go off. I mean, I don't know how many people have read that Bolter book, Extinction, Evolution, the End of Man. It's got some really interesting statistics along those lines, very interesting statistics, which weren't actually brought out in the text of the book. But if you look at the statistics, what he did is he said, let's look at the probability of essentially extinction for man. Well, mammals have been going extinct very rapidly, not in the historical times, but in the last 20,000 years since people started killing them off. And large mammals have been going extinct even faster, and primates even faster. And if you start looking at hominids, which he didn't do,
it's even faster.
Okay. Statistically, that's not a very good track record, right? We're sort of in the sights. So.
But they can split. I mean, of course, that's another way of going extinct is by splitting.
Can I just, if we're interested in immortality or longevity, we might consider the question of using our newfound knowledge to increase the longevity of the human species. And for that to happen, we don't need to maximize our height or our IQ, but we should think about, well, can genetics say anything about the headlong rush to self-destruction that the world of the human species seems to be headed toward?
I'd like to debate this notion that you can use statistical analysis to figure out what's going to happen to the human species, because we are so different than every other species in many ways. The first of which is, I know you're going to deny this, the first of which is that in other species, natural selection works on genes that are more fit, and more fit genes are the genes that provide, in the first order, more offspring to an individual. And if human civilization grows, and let's say I'm taking now the opposite view of what I said before, that civilization actually does spread around the entire world in industrialized countries, there aren't traits that make people have more babies that are going to be transmitted from one generation to the next. I mean, smarter people don't have more babies than dumber people, no matter what it is that makes people smart or dumb. No matter what it is that makes people more beautiful people don't have more babies than less beautiful people in an industrialized liberal democracy where people choose, and people don't have,
But religion does. Religions do.
Well, that's an interesting, sidelight. But people choose not to go to their reproductive potential. Most people in industrialized countries have fewer babies than they are capable of. So all of these things act against natural selection. So I don't think that we can put the human species as a point within this sort of statistical realm. Now, people argue, well, we're destroying the Earth, and there are counter arguments that say we're hyper adaptable, and that we figure out solutions to the problems that are thrown against us. So I'm not convinced it's inevitable. I mean, obviously we're going to go extinct in 5 billion years when the sun burns out. But the question is, how long is it going to be? I'm not convinced it's inevitable.
Can I just build on this? I thought I heard this gentleman's question as, do you guys think that we're inevitably headed for a split? I thought that was a pretty interesting question. A split in humans.
Well, since I brought it up, I might just say, no, I think it's a metaphor. It's an analogy used to show in Silver's book, and particularly in Swift and in Wells, the catastrophe that might happen if certain practices are followed. They didn't know today's practices, but they did see that was something that would be dreadful to happen. This was the idea of the monster, that the human being would end up by dividing into two monstrous species. And I think it's a way of cautioning us to use restraint.
And I'm not sure about two species either, but I'm sure that some I think Evelyn put it very well, that some humans will be modified or have themselves modified to such an extent that they will be seen by the vast majority of other humans as akin to a separate species.
I'd like to raise a question that hasn't received much discussion, surprisingly, and this is not necessarily for any of you, but it could be for anybody who wants to pick it up, who thinks that we ought to go ahead and do a good deal of experimentation, at least with respect to genetic manipulation, and that is, what do you do with all the cases that you may wind up with that don't work out so well? What are our obligations, responsibilities with respect to human creatures whose genes we've modified, and who in one way or another are failures in terms of what we were hoping to achieve, or the law of unintended consequences produces behavioral or other such manifestations that we find pretty undesirable. Do we have all the same obligations to them that we have to children who come into the world in the usual ways, or are we allowed in such cases to scrap them because they were in the form of experiments, or there's a whole range of moral questions that arises with respect to the outcomes of such efforts. Do special obligations attach to them because we did intervene? And so this may be more of a social policy question than an abstract moral question, but I think it certainly does have moral dimensions. And we are playing God when we're doing this, and we're all assuming, I think, that there aren't any moral absolutes that we can appeal to religiously or metaphysically that are going to settle the question for us. How do we get a grip on this question?
We have to answer this question and take one more because of the termination of the system. So did somebody want to, what's that?
I think that question should be addressed to Lee.
That'd be fine with me.
To Lee, yes.
I'd be happy to address that question.
I think it's important to understand, what do you mean by we? I mean, children who are born today, I mean, there actually are a lot of children, unfortunately, born today with horrible birth defects. 4% of all children are born with serious birth defects today. So what happens? Parents take care of their children, first of all, and if they can't, or they abandon their children, then the state becomes the warden of the children. I mean, children don't belong to, and I mean, Evelyn may disagree with me, but in industrialized countries, children don't belong to the society. I mean, children are treated as children. I don't think they're going to be treated as machines or objects. And I don't think that this technology is going to be used if that kind of risk is so high. And we also have to understand that reproductive technologists today use things like amniocentesis and abortion to get rid of all the mistakes that happen during IVF procedures. So there aren't any babies born.
So we can have one last question. Anybody? Larry Sulak?
Although it's perhaps not directly related to the last stream of discussions, I thought Anthony asked a very good question, namely, in the next 50 years or so, are there other defining technologies that might naturally supplant the primacy of what we've been discussing? And let me take my own slight stab at answering that one. You brought up two of them, namely quantum computing and string theory. And it seems to me that what we've been discussing here is far more overarching than those two, at least from my limited perspective. And that's for the following reasons. We've heard from Christine that we're going to be manipulating individual atoms. Well, in fact, we've been doing it for about 15 years or so with a scanning tunneling microscope. And what quantum computing will do for us, other than solving factorization problems and things like that, which are good for codes, but not earth-shattering, at least in my estimation, what those quantum computers will do for you is solve the equations that tell you how atoms work. And that'll make us know how to make smaller and smaller devices and how to send electrons down an electron wide wire and things like that. But I don't think that's much more than what we've already been doing. Similarly, for the string theory, our concept of nature since calculus has been to separate the continuum that we think space and time are made up into points in space and time. And what string theory tells us is that you can't encode everything in an individual point. You have to have a little loop or a band or something that has many variables there instead of one, or maybe some dimensions are in fact curled up. But that again is not an earth-shattering concept, at least in my estimation. So I think, frankly, that the big things that are going to happen in the next 50 years will include indeed quantum computing and string theory, but I don't think they'll have anywhere near the impact that this conference has looked at.
Can I just say one quick thing about that? It's in the nature of defining technologies that you can't predict which one is going to dominate your imagination, because it depends what is done with it. It would be certainly impossible for us to say what the next one would be. I think the important thing is to step back and see our defining technologies for what they are and realize that they are not necessarily the final product.
I want to say one thing. I agree with that, but I also would suggest that we have an example of a defining technology that has displaced to some degree the Turing machine, namely the internet. It's given us a whole new set of metaphors with which to, especially in thinking about biology.
I think we're supposed to have, someone is to wrap up, I don't know. You are. Wonderful. It's your turn. Well, David Frumkin.
All I need is a mic. Does this one work? Yes. Good. So, on behalf of the Pardee Center, I want to thank all of our inspired and inspiring speakers, and want to thank Charles DeLisi and Kenneth Lewes and everybody else involved in the organization of this conference. I think it's been a great event. And finally, the next move for speakers, discussion leaders, and invited guests is to the 7th floor for lunch. Do stop by the coat check place to get your things on the way out, because it turns out that after we have gone down to the 7th floor, the building is going to lock this floor, and we won't be able to get back up. So, thanks to all of you.